Welcome everyone to today's webinar, EHR Success is More Than Luck, the Importance of Revenue Cycle in Your Epic Go Live. I'm Morgan Hafner with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We're looking forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording. At this time, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Julie Roberts to introduce our speakers and begin today's presentation.
Hi, thank you, Morgan. Hello, everyone, and first, thank you for spending a piece of your St. Patrick's Day with us on a very interesting topic today around revenue cycle and Epic Go Live. I'm going to be your moderator, as Morgan indicated, and with me today I have two guests, and so I want to introduce them first. Sarah Armstrong, who is the EVP of Client Integration and Optimization. She's been with us here at Ensemble since 2016 and comes with a variety of background in both revenue cycle operations from an acute and a physician side, along with has significant depth and experience in Epic conversions. Also with us is Shana Tate, who has been in revenue cycle for well over 14 years in both the acute and physician space. She's joined Ensemble in 2020 with us, and today will bring us a really interesting perspective on an Epic Go Live experience. The three of us, as a collective, have worked here at Ensemble and have had multiple experiences in both revenue cycle and with Epic conversions. But today we're going to spend a little bit of time really digging deep into that experience in more of a facilitator-led experience. So although you see an agenda here, it is a formal agenda, you're going to hear us really discuss key topics that we're hoping that you can walk away with as little gems or little nuggets in your own Epic journey experience. So let's talk for a minute about our agenda. I know we have an hour together, and we are going to spend a little bit of time together at the end with your Q&A. So Morgan had indicated that there's a Q&A box. We always welcome those questions from the audience. So, we're going to spend probably about 15 minutes at least or so getting to know what you want to know from us. So keep that in mind as we go through this content today. We're first going to tell you a little bit about who Ensemble Health Partners is. And then we're really going to dig into some very specific questions and situations around the Epic conversion that we recently experienced. So in order for you to get to know Ensemble, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Armstrong.
Thank you, Julie, for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone on the call today. Appreciate you joining. So Ensemble Health Partners is a rapidly growing revenue cycle outsourcing firm. As Julie mentioned, I joined Ensemble in 2016. I think I was employee number 630 at the time, and now you can see that we have over 6,800 associates. We do have a large national presence. We've got a few states there in the middle that we don't have presence in, but we do have one international client in Ireland. And really, we're a collective of revenue cycle operators that, had our own experiences working for providers and had relationships with vendors, over the course of our careers. And we really came together and said, our founder, Judson Ivey, has a very deep experience in revenue cycle, and he has amassed a group of leaders that have that experience and want to be the vendor partners that we wish we had when we were on the other side of the desk. So that's really who we are. We have a lot of Epic clients. We also have clients that are not on Epic, but you can see our national presence there. And we're also very proud of our performance with those clients. We were the first revenue cycle outsourcing firm to win a MAP award on behalf of a client. We're very proud of that. We're also very proud of our Best in Class awards. And it's not, for us, it's not just about, are you hitting metrics? It's also about the relationships that we have with our clients, the partnership. And we love that our clients will call us, when they have a question, even if it's not something that's specific to revenue cycle, just so that we can help and advise with our presence across a number of clients. A lot of people are trying to solve for the same thing. So being able to be an advisor of sorts and a great partner, we're obviously very proud of our achievements in that space.
Thanks, Sarah. So that kind of frames up a little bit about us, so kind of our perspective and background. We want to frame up the conversation for you and really kind of set the stage, and that's what this slide content provides you. So during today's discussion with Sarah and Shana, we're going to talk about that shared experience, and it was at a particular client, and this is the client blueprint, if you will. To frame it up, the organization that we facilitated this experience in is a 21-hospital facility. It's an integrated health system, complex, multifaceted, has about over 800 employed providers. You can see the NPR there, but a couple of things I want to ensure that you understand and have context for. For this particular client that went through their Epic journey, they went through it in parts and pieces. Very complex organization. 7 of the facilities converted in 2014. And then there was some distance, I would say, in order to convert the remainder. The conversation and experience today is really going to focus on those 12 converted facilities that occurred in October of 2020. And we have a quick note there. We all know that during that time frame, that was amidst the COVID pandemic. And so today's discussion will lead into the discussion with Shana Tate. And Shana's perspective is from an operator's perspective, right? She, at this particular organization, led the central billing office in revenue cycle and had the great responsibility of leading her team through this activity. And so, Shana, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Julie.
We're going to just jump right in. So I think we framed it up for our audience. They know the perspective. They have a little bit about the landscape. So let's just jump in and talk about, at the time during Go Live, talk to us about the Go Live project and if you felt that, how things were going, if it was on track, or if you had significant risks from that project perspective.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone on the call. I'm honored to be here and to talk through this. Hindsight is always 20/20, so lots of lessons learned through this that I am happy to share with the group. But, to answer your question, were we ready from a project perspective? And so what we were doing at the organization was we were working through the project plan. We had all of the right players in the right spot. Again, I want to be very clear around the project. We had the implementation and we had all green check marks. We had everything in place. We had all of our committees going. We had the meetings established. We were trying to work through all of the build and building upon the system build that was already in place and migrating the new facilities over. So yes, so we were ready from an IT project plan implementation. And what I want to point out here, there is a difference between project readiness and operational readiness, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But from a project IT perspective, we were definitely ready. IT had also brought in an external third party to really help through that project plan to make sure that we hit our marks, we stayed on the timeline, and the build was accurate and complete. So at this time, there were no risks that were bubbling up. Things were moving very smoothly, honestly.
Great. All right. So again, thinking about you and your position, you had, 400 plus folks, right, that you oversaw operations operational needs for at the time. So as a business office leader, what concerns did you have about the project, not in relation to the project, right? It sounded like you told us that everything was green. You felt that organizationally the team was rowing in the right direction. But what about your team and the readiness around revenue cycle operations?
Yeah, so, to start out, I didn't really have any concerns, which I thought was a little strange because this is a huge implementation. Again, we were migrating right along. Well, as we were going along and at the executive level, we were seeing everything's green, everything's on track. I kept hearing chatter behind me, which would be my team. There were things that were starting to crop up that just did not make sense with the current project plan. So that's when it really started to fork, if you will, because we started to realize, oh wow, from a build perspective, we're great. From an operational readiness perspective, there are some concerns. And so some of the areas that really started to highlight for me was, wow, take a step back, and when you start peeling back the onion of really what is happening and where this chatter is coming from, really starting to realize this undertaking was much, much larger than what we expected. Again, this organization already had some facilities on Epic. It should have just, for us, been a seamless, smooth move, if you will, just to migrate over, build, and then keep rocking and rolling as normal. But what we started to realize was how large this was and how the build into every department, into all the linkages, really highlighting that integrated system versus the siloed system really became important for us to take a step back and wonder, how are we going to handle this? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The second thing that I think really started to as we're understanding how large this was and all the things that we were doing, was I started noticing we were trying to replicate the processes that were bad in the legacy system, which is why we were converting to a new system. And so hindsight, again, 2020, looking back and thinking, wow, we really should have articulated what those processes should be and develop those policies around that, and not just take what we were doing here and transferring it over to there.
Right. I'm going to ask, when the audience sees kind of don't replicate bad processes, right? Someone in their journey on this call may or may not, be going through that exact scenario. What is an example, right? Give us a real life example of what process was at risk at replicating, right, bad processes that maybe someone on this phone could hear and flag for themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as an example, one of the things that we began noticing was happening was the system edits that you have in place. When you do your registration, it flows through coding, and then it begins to drop into your clearinghouse. The edits were just being replicated within the clearinghouse instead of into the host system like it should. And so those processes is what legacy was used to. They knew how to fix those edits. They knew how to accurately get those claims out. What they didn't necessarily understand or realize is how that needs to happen within the Epic system. So that is one example that as we were going through, that really was a bad process that we really should have stepped back and said, oh, wait a minute, how should this happen?
Right. No, that makes complete sense. I want to invite Sarah in on this discussion to really focus on a key point that you spoke about, which is really, getting work done, right? There was so much work. And, what are some of those, what's that perspective in terms of tips and tricks that folks on this phone can think about related to competing priorities and balancing day-to-day operations with looking forward at the go live that could be happening in 18 to 24 months from today's date?
Yeah, I think, what I've seen in my experience is it's very difficult to prioritize work today that's going to manifest 18 or 24 months from now versus a fire that is on fire today. And I think, having gotten to know Shana very well, Shana was trying to manage, a pressing matter, right? The cash coming in the door was of utmost importance, making sure that the organization stayed solvent. There was a lot going on related to COVID and, on top of just general revenue cycle work. And so, it's very difficult from an operator's seat to choose to invest time and energy in designing future processes or even educating yourself on, what Epic can do, what are the Epic best practices so you can plan forward. And so it just so happens that, I'll schedule myself for education, next week. Well, then another fire comes up, and so it becomes the week after that, and then another fire comes up, and it becomes the week after that. And so I think those competing priorities are so relevant. And it's not just, taking care of, having a plan for your legacy AR, which is always on your go-live strategy, right? How are you going to handle your legacy AR? It's also how are you as a leader balancing planning for the future while also taking care of today's needs.
That's right, Sarah. And that goes exactly as knowing who's on point. We knew who the leader was. I was leading the effort, but really, did we have somebody on point beneath me that was really, their role was to not only manage operations, or maybe you just focus on operations, but I need person B over here to focus on the Epic Go Live. So having those point people in place so that there isn't a constant competition with what am I going to do with my time? Something is going to suffer.
And I think also, Shana talked about replicating bad processes. Sometimes we don't even know they're bad processes. So, her example of claim edits is very classic, right? That was the only option available to them at the time. So thinking that there was another option available in an Epic system wasn't even really discussed. So when you think about all of that planning, really taking the time to evaluate why is this process like this? Is it because there are system limitations? And then having someone else to help guide you to say, well, this is how it could work in Epic. That takes a lot of subject matter expertise and takes a lot of time. And people are just always under that pressure. It's hard to make those decisions.
Yeah, I agree. So, Shana, the last point on here I just want to just touch on briefly is really, at the time, just quickly, you had some resident historians leave the organization, unrelated to, the goal live, but how did you deal with that? How did you handle that situation? Well, that was probably one of the more difficult ones because, in a traditional organization, you have limited resources. So therefore, you have limited people who really are the subject matter experts, and it's typically your leaders of the area. So when those leaders leave, do you think about, what's my plan? And so there was a lot of shuffling. There was a lot of, let me just find the best fit for this role and quickly get them up to speed. And we did that, and we got lucky in some areas. But this is something that you really have to keep on as a risk through the entire project, because should those people leave, you need to be able to quickly backfill or quickly pull in somebody that can then step in and take over and keep the project going to its success. Well, thanks for sharing that. Let's dig into our next question for the group, which is really, what are some pitfalls that you experience that you can, identify, right, and share your personal experience with this group? Yeah, so one of the things that I really want to be transparent about is I was not an Epic expert. And in some cases, I wouldn't even say that I was a full integrated revenue cycle expert. The organization was siloed in some respects. The legacy system that we had in place was extremely siloed, so you didn't really have to worry so much about what the OR was doing. They had their own system. You didn't have to worry, much about that and really understand those connections. So one of the things that, was a huge pitfall was understanding that translation from your old legacy system to Epic. And there's some examples here that really kind of caught us off guard. Simple things like a hospital service code versus department means the same thing, but unless you know that mapping and you understand that, you're talking about two different things, or you assume you are. Patient type, patient class, same kind of thing. So really having that, I'm going to say that mapping to all of that to make sure that you understand when you're building and working on the Epic project, that you know where that's coming from the legacy, so that way you can step in and help bridge those gaps or those, areas of opportunity, I'll say.
Yeah.
And then
I just want to ask you quickly, for when you talk about translating, did you find that you spent your time translating more to other revenue cycle functions, or in the healthcare system doing that work cross-function, right? Revenue cycle to clinical, revenue cycle to finance. Where did you find that you were spending a lot of your time helping do that translation?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and a great call out, because we were doing it sort of all over the place. So revenue cycle really became the translator of all things within the system. So even the clinical translator, let's say, clinical was used to topic A or verbiage A, and that's how they knew it. They're depending on us to say, well, what does that mean? How does that change my workflow? What do I need to do? Why is this different than this? And how do I report on that? Finance is a huge component of that, and really understanding the effects on reporting when you change your terminology. And when you change your whole legacy system versus, now in a fully integrated system, it's making sure that they are well engaged from the beginning and understanding the effects that it's having. Great. And then I'll say, secondly, not only is it the translation, it's really the responsibility of the mapping between clinical and revenue cycle. So it's important, for us, what we learned was, wow, there were registration flow changes that we didn't fully understand until we went live. And so there were discharging, who discharges what? How does that happen? How do you educate now the clinical team, that they are now going to start discharging where they never did before?
Yeah, and I will add, I think the other thing that's unique in the Epic system is how the data, you talked about the data flow, Shana, and how that impacts reporting, but it does also impact workflow. So in a legacy system, a physician order may just be there for documentation purposes. In Epic, a physician order drives all kinds of things, right? And so helping everybody understand, how does this data element that maybe not have been meaningful to you before, now it is exceptionally meaningful, because it's going to route things a certain way, it's going to generate this kind of data, it's going to flag an account in a certain way. And I think that's really important, that that collaboration between revenue cycle and the clinical areas is so key.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, because it kind of goes, sort of to the last box of really realizing how large this transition really was. And for me, again, it goes back to, we're in there every day. We're strategically trying to keep revenue cycle going. And one of the things you really have to really focus on is that shift in priorities is really, you've got to be able to pull in external help. That is my one suggestion is, somebody to come in and help you as you're leading revenue cycle and you're managing your areas, that you have that help. And then question everything. Don't feel like when you're questioning that you're questioning the people. You're really trying to question the process and why are we doing it this way. I think your order example is a perfect example, because in the legacy system, the order didn't hardly drive anything for us. But understanding in Epic how it drives everything. And then, lastly, I want to say, the training and education.
That's really important. You cannot train and educate the areas enough, especially when you have that large of a transition and you have role changes.
Mm-hmm.
So, those are areas of pitfalls that I would call out just from learning and going through this. And lastly, I'll say that, again, be transparent with yourself as you're doing it, and realize you are not all things knowing. And again, I can't say it enough to question everything and really make sure you understand that transition.
Yeah, I can't agree more. All right, so let's kind of give our listeners a little bit of more information about, as Go Live got closer for this particular client, what was shifting within the landscape, right? What was going on that was also adding to, some of the focused work?
Yeah. So I think we're all well aware of COVID and the impact it's had on almost all healthcare organizations. But, you've got your volumes that are changing. Our organization actually stopped doing elective procedures, only emergent procedures only. So our focus became, we have got to get the cash in the door. We're trying to squeeze every dollar we can, and that was really the main focus. Now, this was almost 6 months before Go Live, 6, 7, 8 months, right around there. So we're deep in the middle of the Epic transition, and COVID hits, and now my focus is, oh my goodness, we have got to make sure, we keep this organization solvent. Mm-hmm. So to add to that, the organization also made a decision to outsource the revenue cycle to Ensemble. And there were various reasons why that decision was made, but that happened around 6 months prior to the Epic conversion. So we've got a pandemic going on, we have reduced volumes, and some of our, the volumes that we're losing are our most profitable volumes. We're outsourcing the revenue cycle in the middle of this, and then here we are. And then we get slammed with, okay, again, we got all the green check marks, we're ready to go, but oh my gosh, operational readiness is not there. Mm-hmm. We are not there. And so that's where we landed in the middle of all this.
Yeah, that's a significant amount of change, right? You have a change from a system conversion. You have change with the global pandemic. I think you touched on something that we want to kind of move into on the next segment, which is really around the difference between project readiness as well as operational readiness. And so, Farah, I'd like to have your perspective on, kind of defining the differences for the audience and giving them some of the perspectives in each of those camps.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Julie. So, when I think about project readiness versus operations readiness, I really see them as two different focuses, both very important, and it's important that they are collaborative and they're not competing priorities. But, when you think about a typical IT project, right, it's build trackers and dependencies and testing plans, and have we identified the appropriate amount of testing scripts, and the ever-present question, how do you do it today, right? That is a key component to project readiness. I think, when you think about that, operational readiness is really more around the change management and people-focused versus task-focused. So, do your people, the 400 people or so that, were in Shayna's camp as an example, do they know how their day-to-day life is going to be different when they show up for work on Go Live Day, and 3 days after that, and 10 days after that? Because every day it changes a little bit more, and it changes a little bit more. And so when we think about that operational readiness, we think about, are people ready to take on different work? Right? So, Epic is amazing at pushing work to the most appropriate place of service. But is everyone ready to receive that work? Do they have a plan for how to work it? Do you need to shift resources from one department to another in order to take care of that work, right? So a lot of operational readiness conversations will boil down to, well, I don't have the people to do that, right? And so then you end up designing around the fact that this department doesn't have quote unquote, the resources. But really, operational readiness would be, a better approach, and obviously my opinion is, well, what's the best way to go about doing the work? And let's have a plan around that. Does that mean we take 2 people from this location and move them to that work? So that's really important. That workflow ownership, like who is responsible for pulling all the right people together, documenting all the pieces, making sure everybody understands what buttons they're supposed to push as you move through some of these more complex workflows. So there are things that, in a legacy system, there's typically a nice big silo between clinical and financial, and Shana talked a little bit about that in her legacy system. And Epic brings all those silos down. And so those integrated workflows are really, things like what do you do when you have an observation downgrade, right, from an inpatient? Nursing has to do things, has to do things, revenue integrity has to do things, billing has to do things. How do you pull all of those things together? And then I would also say revenue stability is huge. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, I think, Julie. But revenue stability is huge, and making sure that as a revenue cycle leader and, a finance leader in the organization, you understand how are charges generated, what if any changes to those charges are going to be made. And then the last piece is education versus training. So training, when you think about training for an Epic Go Live, training is I'm going to teach you how to log into the system, and I'm going to teach you how to click through these buttons. Education is this is why, right? This is a much bigger picture. This is how you use a dashboard to manage AR versus this is how you work an account. And I think that that's an important distinction and a gap that we see often in Go Live readiness.
Yeah, I think that perspective is good for the audience to kind of see the difference as we're talking about these things. Let's go and kind of dig into, there are always in any project blind spots, right? That you have to mitigate and manage. The IT team is focused on their particular items, but revenue cycle has a slightly different focus. So, Sarah, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the biggest blind sides that folks on the phone can consider?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pain points, and it's consistent in all of my Go Live experiences, is charging. And this, for the purposes of this conversation, we'll kind of focus on acute charging. Physician charging also can be difficult, but the more complex is the acute charging. And I think the thing that folks typically struggle with is charges is perceived as a billing function.
Yes.
And charging is really a team sport. It is the responsibility of all parties, right? Whether you're a nursing unit, whether you're radiology, whether you're lab or pharmacy, and helping everybody understand how all of those pieces fit together. It's like a little game of Tetris that generates a charge at the end. And I think in our experience, our collective experience last fall, everyone was working very, very hard in their black box, but they didn't really understand the before and the after, and therefore, there was slow resolution to things because they didn't really know what information do I need from this other department in order to get these charges in. And then I think, understanding how your legacy system, and Julie, I know you've got a lot of subject matter expertise on this topic, so I'll let you get into the weeds of this, but understanding how your legacy system charges supplies, as an example, is a very important topic. And I would say that how you establish that revenue tracker, that true north to understand, where do you have revenue anomalies and how do you go attack them would be kind of my key components. I'm sure you've got something to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think what I would say is, with an Epic conversion, you touched on it with it being a team sport. It's really important for folks to go into an Epic conversion with the mindset of this is now a clinically driven revenue cycle. And to your point earlier about charges being in a black box that happens in billing, that's no more. And so if you're somebody in your business office that hasn't reached across the table to your supply chain management folks, I would suggest you do that, right? The activity that happens and the connectivity between Optime and your supply chain is key to making sure that clinician can drop the right implant or device for that particular patient on time, accurately, and compliantly. That's the focus, and so we would recommend looking across the table outside of revenue cycle as the charging components are focused more on it being a clinically driven environment. So if you're not talking to your CNOs, if you're not talking to your clinical informaticists, those folks that know what is in a physician's mindset of how they do their documentation, we'd recommend start having those conversations today.
Yeah, and I would also kind of, to our previous question, I think the other opportunity is understanding if you have variances in your charging practices. Mm-hmm. So, doing that charge alignment. One example that came up was moderate sedation. We had some facilities that charged for moderate sedation, and we had other facilities that didn't charge. That was just a philosophy. They didn't charge for moderate sedation. So understanding those things, making sure that your CDM is clean and that you have all those charges available to all those departments so that you're not, you're minimizing the what to charge mm-hmm. as you're educating on how to charge.
Right.
Because as those become blended, it's a lot more change management for those that are impacted.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go to, as we dive in, we kind of alluded to this fact about, how can an organization get in front of issues ahead of time, right? Shana talked about her personal experience around, who, at the time, what she was going through and who to involve in. So let's talk about, involving experts, subject matter experts, or other parties to make sure that you get that clarification.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about this, and certainly, Shana, you chime in as well. I think, everybody has those subject matter experts, and understanding who those legacy subject matter experts are and getting that buy-in into the organization is very important, both in the revenue cycle and in the clinical areas. Making sure your finance team is highly engaged. There's a lot of things that only they know about, right? They only see the report card at the end. And so helping them kind of walk back to say, this is how that's going to be different in an Epic conversion. And then, the outside help, I would say there's some amazing, consulting firms that do this all day long. And I know people struggle sometimes with how do you select the right one. Everybody has their own kind of flavor for this work, but, it really is important. Shana, you talked earlier about you didn't know what you didn't know about Epic. And so having someone to come alongside you to say, let's redesign this workflow now versus later, I think is really important. And then I think the other component is, and then when you bring all these experts together, you got to know who's in the driver's seat, right? So who ultimately is responsible, if we are just talking about charging, right? Who ultimately is responsible to make sure that all the people are getting pulled in, that the workshops are happening, that the tracker is correct, that the baselines have been signed off on. The person in the driver's seat isn't necessarily the person that does all the work, but you kind of have to have that overarching coach. Because there's a lot of players on the field, right? So you got to have that overarching person that can see all the pieces and make sure that the dots are being connected all together.
Great. All right, let's talk about one of the key things that typically always comes up as related to an Epic Go Live, right? Resources and time are not infinite, and no matter if you start 18 to 24 to however many months in advance, there's always that moment that there's a decision or multiple decisions around what can we fit in at Go Live, right? What can get done? IT resources are tight, right? Timelines are tight versus what needs to go from an optimization or post-Go Live perspective. I think many organizations kind of contend with what's the criteria that I need to think about in relation to that as I go through my Epic journey.
Yeah, I think, Epic has a great foundation system that has, core components of functionality. I think where, the devil's in the details on this when you really get into the scope of what you're going to go live with. And so, as a revenue cycle person, we want to understand what's the ROI on the additional investment. If we have to add a couple of build analysts as an example, but we can generate X dollars more in point of service collections, and there's minimal risk, then, we're always balancing that risk versus reward. And I would say, again, around the scope, one example that I would use, Julie, is in patient estimates, right? Mm-hmm. Most people go live with Patient Estimator, but it's how much how deep and how wide do you go with that patient estimator? So some people will say, let's just go live with, radiology, that straight CPT code. Your contracts are in the system. It's, kind of minimally invasive. Those are typically scheduled in advance. Which, okay, that's fine, but the patient estimate experience can be so much more than that, right? It can really be any ancillary. You can, expand it into your inpatient and into your EDs and helping really think about the patient experience and educating your entire patient base, as well as, improving your point of service and upfront collections and reducing your bad debt. That to me is a worthwhile investment.
Right.
That was just one example. There's many, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's going to be key, right? Because when you talk about the reward, and it's easy when you're talking about a system install, but patient experience should be key, right? That should never be a lens that you let off of or don't look through for that particular experience. So I think that was helpful to provide that context to the group. And there's always some, decision points that would influence that. So, all right, let's keep moving and talk a little bit about why revenue cycle engagement is so important.
Yeah, so personally speaking, I've seen so many organizations where the key to what's happening across the organization is in the billing office, right? The billing office is making changes, is adding modifiers, they're doing all kinds of things to get the bills out the door and get the money in. And so, the revenue cycle really holds a lot of secret sauce to help drive workflow improvement throughout the organization. And so I would say, get input from the revenue cycle, understand what those pain points, those difficult workflows are pre-go live, and then make sure that you have a plan for that, and then have that collaborative approach to workflows. It's real easy for, people to kind of make decisions based on their own perspective without, considering all perspectives.
Yeah, and I just want to add that I think we need to be very clear that as you're going through your transition to Epic, that you realize this is not an IT project. This is a revenue cycle project. This is an operational and clinical cycle project. So keep that on the forefront. Again, not an IT project.
Exactly. Thanks for honing in on that message. All right, let's go into kind of what areas, right, have the largest impact on revenue cycle processes, operations throughout a conversion. So Sarah, I think earlier in the conversation we were talking about the importance of those clinical areas, whether it be the nursing floor, ambulatory area, having those procedural areas involved in decision-making processes. You also touched on finance and I touched on supply chain, but any other particular group you want to identify with the group on today?
Well, I would just say, you can see on the slide everybody plays a role, but my general comment to this is, the revenue, now all of these people are in fact part of the revenue cycle. So while revenue cycle may in a legacy system be defined one way, all of these people that you see on the screen they have a component of revenue cycle. And so you got to wrap your arms around them and make sure that you're collaborating with them and driving the best outcome.
Great. All right, so we talked about a lot. Shana gave us her perspective, and we peppered in some very specific items to consider. But let's kind of wrap this up in a bow and provide some last tips from the experts.
Yeah, so we'll go through these quickly. I think, as you've heard, collaboration is very important. So establishing a strong cross-functional governance committee, with a charter and membership and, those guiding principles, whether that's Epic First or, standardization and patient experience, those things is very important. We are big fans of SBARDs, right? The situation background, assessment, recommendation, and decision forms. I think a lot of organizations fall privy to an operator telling the IT team or the build team, make Epic do this. And you really want to establish that the operations team should be opening tickets or making requests based on what is the outcome they're trying to achieve, and let the build team determine what's the right configuration, or otherwise your system will get all kind of wrapped up like a pretzel. We've talked about educating your leaders, whether that's sending them to ARCR, having them do site visits at other Epic organizations. Epic obviously is a very strong community and will participate in that. We've talked quite a bit about bad processes. And then the last thing is, really optimize those workflows. Question the why. Shana said it best, question everything, and making sure that if you have a problem today, you don't carry that over, and that you look to Epic to solve it for you, because many, many times it can.
Well, those are great takeaways for our group. I know we committed on the front side of this presentation that we would definitely reserve time for Q&A, and we've had a busy little chat box in here that we want to go ahead and address. So I will preface this by saying we're obviously still taking questions. Please provide your questions. We're here to help serve you and what questions may be surfaced for you in particular. But since we have plenty of them, we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. So one of the questions that came in is, what culture impacts have you experienced as a result of an Epic conversion?
Ooh, I'll start, and then Shana, you chime in. I think one of the biggest struggles is the transparency, and getting that area of ownership and the transparency of a dashboard to say this is what's outstanding, this is who owns it. I think that can be unsettling for organizations that may have had a lack of transparency, and it all of a sudden doesn't feel good to think, oh, I'm the one that's holding up all this stuff, or my department is the one holding up all this stuff. I didn't know that I was doing that before. So I think that is very challenging for organizations, and then obviously that sense of collaboration. Shana, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say probably what I saw the most in the legacy system, again, we've talked about they're very siloed. Clinical did their work, billing did their work, and it was very separate. So the culture has shifted quite significantly, because now you're seeing everybody work very much together. They understand that what they're doing on the front end, whether that's clinical, whether it's patient access, has an impact all the way through the Epic system and all the way through to the bill. So that culture, I think, is shifting and becomes more collaborative, just like you said. I think you said it really well, Sarah.
Good. All right. Looking in our questions, I think, Shana, this might be a great question for you to address, which is, how would you as a revenue cycle leader balance your current day-to-day responsibilities, right, with the demands, which that's an accurate representation, right, demands of the implementation responsibilities?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and realizing that not all organizations have the luxury of added expense to either hire somebody to come in or to add additional FTEs to support that. So assuming that you don't have that, really what I learned through the process is dedication. So you're going to have to separate time for operations and time for the Epic project. And then second to that is really find somebody within your organization that you trust and depend on, that they could be that major component. They can help you really drive the Epic organization while you're also focusing on driving operations. So it's really just about time management, but not letting either one slip.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier, considering partners, right, that could be an opportunity for folks to evaluate, right? What is the ROI for, getting someone in to help support and kind of split those responsibilities, if you will.
And I'll add to that, I think, that's a great point, is it would definitely have been worthwhile for me to come out of the gate saying, I need my own project management team, whatever that looks like. A third party, that comes in and sits beside me. I think that would have been well worth my time, and it really probably would have saved a lot of the rework we had to do on the back end once we went live.
Well, one of our audience members asked for a little bit more specifics around the environment or the landscape. So the question that came in was the revenue cycle conversion a part of a larger conversion that included the clinical EHR conversion? Can we just comment on that and give folks the landscape?
Yeah, so absolutely. This was, the big bang, so to speak. So we did clinical, EHR, and we did the whole financial component all in one swoop, and we did all facilities at once.
Yeah. And there had been an ambulatory conversion about 3 months prior to that. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So we went through it on the ambulatory side as well.
Great. All right, next question that came in is regarding revenue integrity. That's something that's near and dear to my heart. So the question is, what would the role of revenue integrity be in an Epic implementation? So,
Julie, go right ahead and answer your own question.
I can't help but jump in as the facilitator, help answer this. So I have a background in mid-revenue cycle space, and I would say the short answer to this is, what's the role of revenue integrity? It is to be a strong influencer and bridge maker, right? So if in the build team meetings, right, you're looking at a CDM or you're talking about charge trigger methodologies, it's easy to look at things black and white when you don't know the clinical workflow, the clinical process to that workflow. And so the role of revenue integrity is really to help be a really good translator, reaching out to those clinical departments to make sure that they understand this is what you would be charging if you document X, right? In your Proc Doc screen, this is what this is going to do on the back end. Is that the procedure that you intend to facilitate? So focusing in on that translation is going to be key. Revenue integrity is also the kind of keeper, right, of ensuring revenue leakage doesn't happen. And so Sarah talked about earlier, working on and functioning within the revenue tracker, right, and tracking that pre-go live results and post-go live. Are we receiving all of the charges or, that we would expect? Revenue integrity has a key role in that work to make sure that the translation is accurate and as expected. Sarah, is there anything you want to share on that?
Yeah, you've covered a lot of it. I would say, when you think about the education, I see revenue integrity really is multifaceted, right? So when we think about the Epic Readiness program, we have folks that are working alongside the clinicians that you talked about and helping them understand what charges are available to them and how to charge for them, but also giving that wraparound support of what to charge. And so, we see a lot of opportunities, again, depending on the maturity of the organization, of helping the charge integrity education up front. But then I would also say revenue integrity is the keeper of all the charge trigger methodologies. So that when you're sitting down to the revenue tracker and something is off, it's typically the revenue integrity department that is running that down and figuring out the root cause of that, and then working with the IT team to figure out, oh, that's a problem in off time. Oh, that's a problem in supply chain. Oh, that's a problem in, whatever clinical department. But revenue integrity is really kind of the keeper of all that and running point.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it for sure, which is, partnering with the IT team, right? The ensuring that those charge trigger methodologies is in place, that people understand them, that's going to be really key to the process. So, all right, questions continue to roll in, so I want to address the next one, which is, what if you're not getting the buy-in needed from certain experts that we had talked about, right? We talked about having a lot of people around the table, but what if you're not getting the buy-in? Any tips on how to manage that?
Oh, gosh. So, it could be for a number of reasons. So maybe, I'm not sure what this particular user is asking, what their experience is. But, I try to practice one of my all-time favorite books is Stephen Coveys' 7 Habits. And his 5th habit is seek first to understand and then to be understood. So my first guidance would be, there's a reason for the resistance. You just probably don't know what it is, whether it's fear of change, whether it's they feel like they're not being heard, or they don't have the resources, or whatever that is. So that would be my first thought is, kind of finding out what is the root cause of the resistance. And then at the end of the day, hopefully in your organization you have some guiding principles, and, is that resistance in concert with your guiding principles? There will be people that don't want to change because they don't want to change. And so, kind of establishing that executive steering committee, that executive leader buy-in where you're kind of, if you've tried everything you can, help, at some point a decision needs to be made. And, just making sure that your governance structure supports that. But again, in my experience, that resistance comes from something. So trying to figure that out. Yeah, so, you know, we did experience some of this in our organization, and a lot of it really routes back to what you're saying. We had a particular area that didn't want to let go with one of their bolt-on systems and said that, you know, if it couldn't perform, couldn't do the things that they needed in order to be efficient. And so it really routed back up through the governance committee. One of the guiding principles is Epic first, and they had to come to prove why they needed this additional system. And so at the end of the day, when they did that, it was squashed simply because Epic could perform the functions, and they just needed to seek to understand that.
That's a good question. That was a good question.
Next question that came in is really around training, which is, we touched on that a moment ago. This particular participant is asking, what's the overall, training experience, in revenue cycle? I know the learning curve for Epic is steep, but what were the biggest hurdles for employees to learn, right, in those various groups, whether that is in your CBO or the clinical team or, finance?
Oh, gosh, there's a lot of things I could say. The one that comes to mind first is a lot of times in Epic systems, the work that's presented to people is repetitive, right? I hit Shift F7 and, whatever, tap, in order to get a bill out the door. And in Epic, right, the system is automating a lot of that repetitive always logic. And so the work that gets presented to end users is what I call gray matter work. It can't be automated for some reason. There needs to be human intervention. And I think, depending on the mix of your team, some people will struggle with the loss of that repetitive type work. And making sure that you have skill building in there. I think the other thing, to be a little bit more specific, is, in my experience, cash posting was, data entry, right? It was, you would type in the account number, or you would download a remit, or, but it was primarily focused on the payment and the contractual. And in Epic, cash posting is really remit posting. It's all of the information on the remit, because all of that remit data drives all these downstream workflows. And so the cash posting team sometimes is the one that has the biggest change, because now they are really the root of a lot of those workflows.
Right. Yeah, I think that's actually very on point, that there's specific groups, right, that really need additional love and support, because, again, everything changes, right? All right, well, it looks like we are at almost the top of the hour. I hope that everyone on the call today was able to glean at least a nugget or two of key information from our particular experience at this client. So I will turn it over to Morgan to close us out.
Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. So I want to give a final thank you to Sarah, Shayna, and Julie for a really excellent presentation today, and also Ensemble Health Partners for sponsoring today's webinar. So please enjoy the rest of your day, and we truly look forward to having you join us for future webinars.